The grand ballroom of the Grandview Hotel fell into an uneasy silence. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden light upon a sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, but every eye in the room was fixed on the figure seated at the magnificent Steinway grand piano. His clothes were worn and weathered, his coat patched at the elbows, his shoes scuffed beyond repair. Moments earlier, this man had been publicly humiliated, told he didn't belong, that his very presence was an insult to the gathered elite. Cassandra Whitmore stood near the stage, her diamond necklace catching the light as her lips curled into a cold smile. She had orchestrated this moment, certain it would end in embarrassment, proving her point that some people simply didn't belong in refined society. The guests shifted uncomfortably, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, waiting to witness what they assumed would be a spectacle of failure. The man's weathered hands hovered above the ivory keys. For 8 long years he hadn't touched a piano. For 8 years he had run from music as if it were a ghost haunting his every step. But tonight, in this room full of strangers who had already judged him, something inside him stirred. A memory. A promise. A melody that had been waiting all this time to be released. He took a breath, and his fingers descended onto the keys. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, to comprehend the journey that led a homeless man to sit at a grand piano before hundreds of the city's most privileged citizens, we need to go back. Back to the beginning of this evening, when the rain was falling, and a man was simply looking for shelter from the storm. The autumn rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, turning the streets of downtown into rivers of reflected light. Inside the Grandview Hotel, a different kind of storm was brewing, though no one knew it yet. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a vision of elegance for the Whitmore Foundation's annual charity gala. White orchids cascaded from towering centerpieces. Candles flickered in hurricane glass holders. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the soft glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers. This was Cassandra Whitmore's night, and she had spared no expense. The widow of tech mogul Richard Whitmore, Cassandra had built her reputation on hosting the most exclusive events in the city. Her charity work was well known. Her name appeared in society columns weekly, and her opinion could make or break a person's standing in their social circle. She moved through this gathering crowd like a queen inspecting her court, her silver gown shimmering with each calculated step, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair not a strand out of place. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to reflect the image she had carefully cultivated over the past decade. The Whitmore name meant something in this city. It meant wealth, taste, influence. It meant knowing your place in the hierarchy of society and ensuring that everyone else knew theirs as well. At precisely 7:15, as the first guests were arriving under the hotel's grand entrance portico, their designer umbrellas held by attentive valets, a figure appeared at the side entrance of the ballroom. He had slipped in through the service corridor, not trying to infiltrate the party, but simply seeking refuge from the rain that had soaked through his thin jacket. His name was Elijah Washington, though no one in that room would have recognized it, and he wasn't looking for charity or attention. He just wanted to be dry for a few moments to warm himself before heading back out into the night. Elijah was 57 years old, though the streets had aged him beyond his years. His dark skin was weathered by sun and wind, his hair more gray than black, his beard untrimmed, but not unkempt. There was something in his bearing, even in his worn condition, that spoke of a different life, a different time. The way he stood, the way he observed the room with quiet dignity rather than envy or resentment. But those details were invisible to the security guard who spotted him almost immediately. "Sir, you can't be in here." The guard's voice was firm, but not unkind. He had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between someone looking for trouble and someone just trying to escape the weather. Elijah nodded, understanding. "I apologize. I was just getting out of the rain. I'll go." But before he could move toward the exit, a sharp voice cut through the gentle murmur of arriving guests. "What is going on here?" Cassandra Whitmore had noticed the disturbance, and nothing happened at her events without her knowledge and approval. She approached with quick, purposeful strides, her eyes narrowing as she took in Elijah's appearance. The worn coat, the scuffed shoes, the unmistakable markers of life on the streets. "How did he get in here, ma'am? He just came in from the rain." "He's leaving now," the guard explained. But Cassandra wasn't interested in explanations. She was interested in maintaining the pristine image of her event. "This is a private function, a charity gala for invited guests. Do you have any idea how much people paid to be here tonight? And do you think you can just wander in off the street?" "I wasn't trying to crash your party," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying a depth and resonance that seemed at odds with his appearance. "I apologize for the intrusion." There was something in his tone, a hint of education, of refinement, that only made Cassandra more indignant. "Please escort him out, immediately, and make sure the side entrances are properly secured. We can't have this kind of thing happening tonight." As the guard gently but firmly guided Elijah toward the exit, several guests had turned to watch the scene unfold. Whispers began to circulate. Cassandra felt the heat of embarrassment rising in her cheeks, not for the way she had treated the man, but for the fact that such an incident had occurred at all. This was supposed to be perfect. Everything was supposed to be perfect. Elijah walked toward the door, with his head up, his dignity intact, despite the humiliation. As he passed by the magnificent grand piano positioned near the stage, his steps slowed almost imperceptibly. His eyes lingered on the instrument for just a moment, a flicker of something memory, perhaps, or longing crossing his weathered face. Then he continued toward the exit back out into the rain. But someone else had noticed that look. Jonathan Hayes, the event coordinator who had been hired to manage the evening's logistics, had been standing near the stage when the incident occurred. He was a man in his mid-40s, someone who had spent enough time in the service industry to know that appearances could be deceiving and that kindness cost nothing. He had seen the way the homeless man looked at the piano, not with the curiosity of someone who had never seen such an instrument, but with the recognition of someone who knew it intimately. As Elijah stepped back out into the rain, Jonathan made a decision. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had grown worse wind, driving the drops sideways under the hotel's entrance awning. Elijah stood at the edge of the coverage, looking out at the streets he would have to navigate to get back to the shelter where he had been staying. It was 3 miles away, and he was already soaked. Another 3 miles in this weather might push his aging body past its limits. "Excuse me," Jonathan's voice came from behind him. Elijah turned to find the event coordinator standing there holding a towel. "I'm sorry about what happened in there. Ms. Whitmore can be particular about her events." "It's all right," Elijah said, accepting the towel. "I understand. I shouldn't have come in. You were getting out of the rain. There's no crime in that." Jonathan hesitated, then made his offer. "Look, I can't let you stay in the ballroom, but the kitchen staff is having their dinner in the back. If you want to get warm and maybe get some food, I can arrange that. It's the least I can do." Elijah looked at this stranger who was showing him kindness when the world so rarely did. "I don't want to cause any more problems. You won't. Come on." The kitchen entrance is around the side. Jonathan led the way, and Elijah followed, grateful beyond words for the simple gesture of human decency. The hotel's kitchen was a world away from the elegant ballroom. Here, amid the stainless steel and tile, the staff moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the gala's elaborate menu. Jonathan found Elijah a quiet corner near the back, away from the main workflow, and brought him a plate of food from the staff meal. Roasted chicken vegetables, fresh bread. Simple food, but to someone who often went hungry, it was a feast. "Thank you," Elijah said, and Jonathan could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. "You're welcome. Take your time. The rain should let up in an hour or so." Jonathan started to walk away, then paused. "I noticed the way you looked at the piano out there. Do you play?" Elijah's hands stilled over his food. The question hung in the air between them like a note suspended in time. "I used to," he finally said. "A long time ago." Jonathan nodded, sensing there was a story there, but respecting the man's privacy. He returned to the ballroom where the gala was now in full swing. Guests mingled over cocktails, examining the silent auction items displayed on elegantly draped tables. Cassandra moved through the crowd, accepting compliments on the venue, the decorations, the entire ambiance of the evening. But then disaster struck. The pianist, who had been hired to provide background music during the cocktail hour, called Jonathan in a panic. His car had broken down on the highway, and he was stuck waiting for a tow truck. He wouldn't make it to the event at all. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. Live piano music had been specifically requested by Cassandra. It was part of the refined atmosphere she demanded. Without it, she would be furious. Jonathan racked his brain for solutions. Call another pianist. At this hour on such short notice, it would be impossible. Use recorded music. Cassandra would never accept that. He was running out of options when his mind drifted back to the man in the kitchen. The way he had looked at the piano. "I used to play," he had said. It was a long shot. It was probably crazy. But Jonathan was desperate. He returned to the kitchen to find Elijah finishing his meal. "I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound strange," Jonathan began. "The pianist we hired can't make it. I need someone to play background music for the next few hours. Just soft, classical pieces, nothing fancy. You said you used to play." Elijah set down his fork slowly. "It's been a very long time, I understand. But I'm in a bind here, and I saw the way you looked at that piano. I'm a pretty good judge of people, and I don't think you just casually played once or twice." Jonathan met Elijah's eyes. "I can't pay you much, but I can offer you $100 for a few hours of playing. And you'd be inside warm doing something I suspect you might actually enjoy." $100. That was a week's worth of meals from the shelter, enough to replace his shoes that were falling apart, enough to make a real difference. But more than the money, it was the piano. Elijah hadn't touched one in 8 years. Hadn't allowed himself to even think about it. The memories were too painful, too raw, even after all this time. But something in Jonathan's face, the genuine kindness, the trust this stranger was placing in him, stirred something inside Elijah. "If I do this," he said carefully, "I need to stay in the background. I just want to play, not be seen. That's fine. You can position yourself where you're not the center of attention. I'll set it up so you're just providing atmosphere." Jonathan felt relief wash over him. "So you'll do it?" Elijah took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll do it." They walked back toward the ballroom together, but before they could reach the piano, Cassandra intercepted them. Her sharp eyes widened with disbelief and anger when she recognized Elijah. "What is he doing back in here?" Her voice was loud enough to turn heads. "I thought I made it clear that he was not welcome at this event." "Ms. Whitmore, the pianist, canceled. Mr. Washington has agreed to fill in," Jonathan explained, keeping his voice level and professional. "Absolutely not. I will not have a homeless man playing piano at my charity gala. What would people think? This is outrageous." Cassandra's face flushed with indignation. Several guests had now stopped their conversations to watch the confrontation unfold. "With respect, Ms. Whitmore, we don't have another option. It's either him or no live music at all," Jonathan said firmly. "Then we'll have no live music. I won't compromise the integrity of this event by having someone like him perform." She looked at Elijah with unconcealed disdain. "Do you even know how to play? Have you ever performed in front of people before? This is a Steinway grand piano, not some toy." Elijah said nothing. He had learned long ago that defending himself to people like Cassandra was futile. She had already made up her mind about who he was, based purely on his appearance. No words would change that. But Jonathan wasn't backing down. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm the event coordinator, and this is an operational decision. Mr. Washington will provide the background music as planned. He'll stay out of the way, and your guests will enjoy their evening. That's what matters." Cassandra's eyes flashed with anger, but she was shrewd enough to know that making a bigger scene would be worse for her image than quietly allowing this to proceed. "Fine, but if he embarrasses me, Jonathan, you're finished in this city. Do you understand?" "Understood." Jonathan turned to Elijah. "Come on, let's get you set up." As they walked toward the piano, Elijah could feel dozens of eyes on him, hear the whispers that followed in his wake. He knew what they were saying, what they were thinking. Part of him wanted to turn around and walk back out into the rain. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for 8 long years, was waking up. And that part wanted to touch those keys one more time. The grand piano sat on a small raised platform at the side of the ballroom, positioned so that it could provide ambient music without dominating the space. Jonathan helped Elijah adjust the bench, ensuring he was comfortable. The instrument itself was magnificent, a concert grand Steinway with a mirror black finish that reflected the chandelier light like still water. "Just play whatever you're comfortable with," Jonathan said quietly. "Soft classical pieces, jazz standards, whatever comes naturally. The goal is to enhance the atmosphere, not to be the center of attention." Elijah nodded, but his hands were trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. 8 years. It had been 8 years since he had played. Would his fingers even remember? Would the music still be there? Or had it died along with everything else? "Take your time," Jonathan said, sensing the man's hesitation. "Whenever you're ready." As Jonathan stepped away to attend to other matters, Elijah found himself alone with the piano. The last time he had been this close to one, the last time he had actually played, was a memory he had spent years trying to bury. It rose now like a tide he couldn't hold back. The conservatory's practice room. Late afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Grace, his 8-year-old daughter, sitting beside him on the bench, her small hands stretched across the keys as she practiced her scales. Her laughter when she made a mistake. Her concentration when she got it right. The way she looked up at him with such pride when he told her she was improving. "Daddy, will I ever be as good as you?" she had asked. "Sweetheart, you'll be better. You have something I had to learn, something that comes naturally to you. You play with your heart." That had been 3 days before the accident. 3 days before everything ended. Elijah pulled his hands back from the piano, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't do this. Every note would be a reminder. Every melody would carry her voice. How could Jonathan ask this of him? How could he have agreed? But then he remembered the kindness in Jonathan's eyes. The food he had been given. The simple act of being treated like a human being instead of an inconvenience to be swept aside. Jonathan had trusted him, had believed in him when no one else would have given him a second glance. And deeper than that, beneath the pain and the fear, there was something else. A whisper of memory that wasn't about loss, but about love. Grace hadn't just learned piano from him. She had loved it. Loved the music, loved the feeling of creating something beautiful with her hands. If she were here now, what would she want him to do? Would she want him to run from the thing they had shared? Or would she want him to remember the joy of it, the pure magic of turning silence into song? Elijah took a deep breath and let his hands settle onto the keys. He started with something simple, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The opening notes were hesitant, uncertain, like a voice that hadn't spoken in years. But as he continued, something extraordinary happened. The muscle memory was still there. The years of training, the thousands of hours of practice, they hadn't disappeared. They had just been waiting. The notes flowed more smoothly now, his fingers finding their way across the familiar patterns. The pain was still there, sharp and present, but alongside it was something he hadn't felt in so long he had forgotten its name. Joy. The simple, pure joy of making music. In the ballroom, conversations had been flowing freely, glasses, clinking laughter rising and falling like waves. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, people began to notice the music. It wasn't intrusive or demanding. It simply was like the candlelight or the scent of the orchids, a perfect addition to the atmosphere. But there was something in it, something that made people pause mid-sentence and listen. Cassandra noticed it too, and it filled her with an uncomfortable mixture of surprise and irritation. She had expected disaster, had anticipated having to swoop in and shut down the embarrassing spectacle. But this was actually good. The homeless man could play, not just play, but truly play. His touch was gentle, yet confident, each phrase shaped with a sensitivity that spoke of real musical understanding. She wouldn't admit it, of course, wouldn't give him the satisfaction, but she couldn't deny what she was hearing. Jonathan stood near the bar, relief flooding through him. His gamble had paid off. Not only could Elijah play, but he was elevating the entire event. Several guests had already approached him to compliment the music, asking who the pianist was. Jonathan deflected the questions, honoring Elijah's request to remain in the background. At the piano, Elijah transitioned from Debussy to Chopin, his fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence. The pain was still there, hovering at the edges of his consciousness like a specter. But for these few moments, for these precious minutes, he wasn't a homeless man in borrowed time. He was a musician. He was doing what he had been born to do. And somewhere in the space between the notes, he could almost hear Grace's laughter. 15 years earlier, Elijah Washington's name meant something in the world of classical music. Not fame in the popular sense, not celebrity or fortune, but respect. Deep, genuine respect from those who understood the craft, who recognized true mastery when they heard it. The Berkshire Conservatory of Music sat on 20 acres of rolling hills in upstate New York, its Gothic revival buildings housing some of the most talented young musicians in the country. Elijah had joined the faculty at 32, one of the youngest professors in the school's history, and over the following decade, he had built a reputation as both a brilliant performer and a gifted teacher. His students won competitions. They went on to prestigious graduate programs and professional orchestras. But more than that, they learned from him that music wasn't just about technical perfection. It was about finding the truth inside the notes and bringing it to life. He taught piano performance and music theory, but his real gift was helping students discover their own voices. Anyone can learn to play the right notes, he would tell them. The question is, what do you have to say? What story are you telling? Music without meaning is just noise, no matter how technically perfect. His own performances were events that the conservatory community looked forward to. Faculty recitals twice a year in the school's beautiful concert hall, and occasional guest appearances with regional orchestras. He had never pursued the grueling life of an international concert pianist, preferring the stability and fulfillment of teaching. But when he did perform, people listened. His specialty was the romantic composers, Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff. Music that demanded not just precision, but passion, not just skill, but soul. He could make a piano sing or weep, could draw colors from the instrument that seemed impossible. Other faculty members would sometimes stand at the back of the hall during his rehearsals just to hear him play, to remind themselves what the piano could do in the right hands. But the center of Elijah's world wasn't the conservatory or the concert hall. It was home. A modest house on a quiet street in the nearby town where he lived with his wife, Margaret, and their daughter, Grace. Margaret was a librarian at the town's public library, a woman with a gentle smile and a fierce intelligence. They had met at a college concert where Elijah had performed, and she had been the one to approach him afterward, unafraid of his growing reputation, interested in the person behind the music. "You play like you're having a conversation with the piano," she had said. "Like your old friends who have known each other forever." He had fallen in love with her in that moment, and over the years that love had only deepened. They were partners in the truest sense, supporting each other's passions, building a life together that was rich, not in material wealth, but in meaning and connection. And then there was Grace. Born when Elijah was 40, she had been a surprise, an unexpected gift that had transformed both their lives. From the moment she could sit up, she had been fascinated by her father's music. As a toddler, she would sit on the floor beside the piano bench while he practiced, her wide eyes following his hands across the keys. By age 4, she was picking out simple melodies by ear. At 6, she began formal lessons with one of Elijah's colleagues. It quickly became clear that Grace had inherited more than just her father's love of music. She had his gift. Her small hands moved across the keys with a naturalness that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. Her ear for tone and phrasing was remarkable for a child her age. But more than her technical ability, it was her emotional connection to the music that amazed everyone who heard her play. When Grace played, she wasn't thinking about the notes or worrying about mistakes. She was simply communicating, telling stories without words. Elijah had taught many talented students over the years, but teaching his own daughter was different. It wasn't just about passing on technique or theory. It was about sharing something that connected them, a language only they spoke, a bond that went beyond words. Their evening practice sessions together were sacred time. Margaret would often sit in the doorway, listening to father and daughter work through pieces together, correcting each other, encouraging each other, laughing when one of them made a silly mistake. "You rushed that passage," Grace would tell her father with mock seriousness. "You're absolutely right," he would reply, grinning. "Let's take it again, and this time let's both get it right." On weekends, they would sometimes play duets. Elijah at the lower end of the keyboard, Grace at the higher, their hands occasionally crossing as they wove the music together. These were the moments Elijah treasured most. Not the faculty recitals or the students' successes or the respect of his colleagues. This, playing music with his daughter, watching her grow into the artist she was becoming, knowing that whatever else happened in the world, they had this connection. The spring before Grace turned 9, the conservatory held its annual spring concert series. Faculty students and guest artists all performed over a 2-week period. Elijah was scheduled to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Conservatory Orchestra, one of the most demanding works in the repertoire. He had been preparing for months, and Grace had been his most enthusiastic supporter, sitting in on his practice sessions, cheering him on. "That part where it gets really fast," she said one evening, her eyes shining. "That's my favorite. It's like you're racing, but you're also flying." "That's a good way to describe it," Elijah said, pulling her close for a hug. "When you're older, you'll play this too. I know you will. Will you teach me every note? We'll work on it together." The night of the performance arrived in late April. The concert hall was packed. Margaret and Grace sat in the third row, Grace in her favorite blue dress, barely able to contain her excitement. She had been to many of her father's performances before, but there was something special about this one. Maybe it was the power of the piece. Maybe it was seeing so many people gathered to hear him play. Or maybe it was simply the feeling that she was watching her hero do what he did best. When Elijah walked onto the stage, Grace applauded so enthusiastically that several people around them smiled. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, sharing her pride. What followed was extraordinary. Elijah had always been a skilled performer, but that night something transcendent happened. He didn't just play the Rachmaninoff. He lived inside it, every phrase charged with emotion, every passage crafted with exquisite care. The famous opening chords rang out with power and melancholy. The lyrical second movement sang with a beauty that brought tears to eyes throughout the hall. And the final movement built to a conclusion that left the audience breathless. When the last chord faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the hall erupted in applause. People stood shouting their appreciation. The conductor embraced Elijah. Orchestra members tapped their music stands in the traditional sign of respect. It was a triumph, the kind of performance that people would remember and talk about for years. But for Elijah, the best moment came later, after he had taken his bows and left the stage when he found Margaret and Grace waiting for him backstage. Grace threw herself into his arms, nearly tackling him with the force of her hug. "Daddy, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You were amazing. You were perfect." He knelt down to her level, still catching his breath from the performance and the emotion of her words. "You think so? I know so. When I grow up, I want to play exactly like you." He smoothed her hair, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "No, sweetheart. When you grow up, I want you to play exactly like you. Better than me. Your own voice, your own story." She nodded seriously, then grinned. "But can we play duets too? Even when I'm grown up, always," he promised. "We'll always play together." It was a promise he meant with every fiber of his being. It was a promise he believed nothing could break. He didn't know that he had less than 3 weeks to keep it. The accident happened on a Saturday afternoon in early May. The weather had been beautiful, one of those perfect spring days when the world seems renewed and full of possibility. Grace had a piano recital at the conservatory, her first public performance in the main concert hall. She had been preparing for weeks, practicing her piece, a Mozart sonata, until she could play it in her sleep. She wasn't nervous. She was excited. Elijah had been planning to drive her himself, but a last-minute issue with the student's jury examination required his presence earlier that afternoon. Margaret offered to take Grace, and they would all meet up at the conservatory before the recital began. It was a small change in plans, nothing that seemed significant at the time. Margaret's car was hit by a drunk driver at an intersection 4 miles from the conservatory. The impact was on the passenger side. Witnesses said the other vehicle ran a red light at high speed, never even attempted to brake. Margaret survived with serious injuries. Grace, sitting in the passenger seat in her new recital dress, did not. Elijah had been in his office at the conservatory reviewing papers when the call came. The hospital. An accident. He needed to come immediately. The drive to the hospital was a blur of panic and prayer. "Please let them be all right. Please let this not be as bad as it sounds. Please, please, please. He found Margaret in surgery. The waiting room nurse tried to prepare him gently, but the words didn't make sense. Grace had been pronounced dead at the scene. They had tried to revive her, but the injuries were too severe. She hadn't suffered. It had been instant. Elijah's world didn't shatter. That word was too dramatic, too clean. His world simply ceased to exist. One moment he had been a father, a husband, a teacher, a musician. The next moment he was nothing. An empty shell standing in a hospital corridor listening to a nurse say words that couldn't possibly be true. When he was finally allowed to see Margaret, she was unconscious, her face swollen and bandaged. 3 broken ribs, a fractured pelvis, internal injuries. The doctor said she would survive, but recovery would be long and difficult. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand, unable to cry, unable to speak, unable to do anything but exist in the crushing weight of what had happened. They held Grace's funeral on a cloudy Thursday morning. The conservatory closed for the day, so everyone could attend. Students, faculty, staff, people from the town. The church was packed with people who had known Grace, who had heard her play, who had seen her bright smile and felt the warmth of her spirit. Elijah sat in the front pew, Margaret beside him, in a wheelchair, her injuries making it impossible to stand. He held her hand throughout the service, but they might as well have been on different planets. They were both drowning in separate oceans of grief. The casket was small, heartbreakingly small, covered in white flowers. At the reception afterward, people approached them with condolences, with tears, with memories of Grace. Elijah nodded and thanked them, but he wasn't really there. He had left his body was floating somewhere above this scene, watching himself go through the motions of being alive. The days that followed blurred together. Margaret came home from the hospital, but she was a ghost in their house. The physical pain from her injuries was compounded by a grief so profound, it seemed to have substance, to have weight. She barely spoke, barely ate. Spent hours sitting in Grace's room holding her daughter's things, her clothes, her books, the stuffed animals that still sat on her bed. Elijah threw himself into work, or tried to. The conservatory had given him bereavement leave, but he returned after only a week, unable to stand being in the house where Grace's absence screamed from every room. But teaching was impossible. He would start a lesson and find himself unable to continue, the words dying in his throat. He would sit at the piano to demonstrate a passage, and his hands would freeze above the keys. Because every time he played, he heard her. Every melody carried her voice. Every chord reminded him of their evenings practicing together. The piano, the thing that had been his life's passion, his gift, his joy, had become an instrument of torture. It was the thing that connected him to Grace most strongly, and that connection was now a source of unbearable pain. 3 months after the funeral, he stopped playing entirely. He would walk into a room with a piano and feel his chest tighten, his breath become shallow. Panic attacks, the doctor called them. Trauma response. He was prescribed medication, urged to see a therapist. He took the pills but stopped after a few weeks. They dulled the pain, but they also dulled everything else, and he needed to feel something, even if that something was agony. His relationship with Margaret deteriorated. They couldn't comfort each other because they were both too broken. Every time they looked at each other, they saw Grace. Every conversation eventually circled back to that day, to the what-ifs and the if-onlys that had no answers. They became strangers, sharing a space, 2 people drowning, who couldn't reach out to save each other because they had nothing left to give. By the end of that first year, Elijah had stopped teaching. He couldn't do it anymore. couldn't stand in front of students talking about music when music had become synonymous with loss. The conservatory was understanding. They extended his leave, assured him his position would be waiting when he was ready to return. But Elijah knew he would never return. That part of his life was over. Margaret filed for divorce 18 months after Grace's death. She was still physically recovering, still in pain every day, but she said she couldn't stay in this house, in this town, in this life that was haunted by memories of their daughter. She needed to start over somewhere else to try to build something new from the ashes. She asked Elijah to come with her, to try together to heal. But he couldn't. He was rooted in place by grief, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in the amber of that terrible day. The divorce was quiet and sad. There was no anger, no fighting over possessions. They both knew they were casualties of the same tragedy, just trying to survive in whatever way they could. Margaret moved to Oregon to be near her sister. Elijah stayed in the house alone. Without teaching, without Margaret, without Grace. Elijah had no structure to his days. He had some savings, the house was paid off, so he wasn't immediately in financial trouble. But he also had no purpose. He would wake up and not know what to do with himself. Hours would pass in a fog. He stopped seeing friends, stopped answering calls from former colleagues who were worried about him, stopped maintaining the house, stopped taking care of himself. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. There were days he didn't leave his bed, days he didn't eat. The house fell into disrepair. Bills went unpaid. The world outside continued turning, but Elijah had stopped moving with it. 3 years after Grace's death, he lost the house. The savings had run out. The unpaid bills had mounted. The bank foreclosed, and Elijah found himself with nowhere to go and nothing left. He packed a bag with what few possessions still mattered to him, a photo of Grace, her favorite stuffed animal, a few clothes, and walked away from the life he had known. The streets were not kind to him, but they were honest. There was no pretense, no expectation that he should be anything other than what he was, a broken man trying to survive one day at a time. He drifted from town to town for a while before settling in the city where the shelters and soup kitchens could provide the basic necessities. He discovered that being homeless was a full-time job. Finding food, finding safe places to sleep, avoiding trouble, dealing with the bureaucracy of social services, and always dealing with the looks. The way people's eyes slid past him as if he were invisible. The way they crossed the street to avoid him. The way he had become, in society's eyes, less than human. Just another unfortunate to be either pitied or ignored. Music was everywhere in the city. Street performers, bars with live bands, the symphony hall, where he would sometimes stand outside just to hear the muffled sounds of the orchestra through the walls. But Elijah never approached a piano. Never let himself even think about playing. That door was closed, locked, sealed shut. To open it would be to open the floodgates of grief all over again, and he barely survived each day as it was. 8 years passed this way. 8 years of surviving but not living. 8 years of carrying his grief like a weight that never lessened. People at the shelters knew him as a quiet man, who kept to himself, who never caused trouble, who had clearly seen better days. Some tried to reach out to offer help beyond food and shelter. He was always polite, but distant. He had learned that accepting too much kindness, forming too many connections, was dangerous. Connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. But on this particular Thursday evening, soaked from the rain and seeking momentary shelter in a hotel ballroom, Elijah had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront everything he had been running from. The piano in that ballroom wasn't just an instrument. It was a door, and Jonathan Hayes had just handed him the key. The soft strains of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drifted through the ballroom. Elijah's fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, the music flowing from some deep place inside him that had been locked away for so long. The guests had settled into their evening, the music becoming a natural backdrop to their conversations, their laughter, their elegant movements through the candlelit space. But inside Elijah, a storm was raging. Every note was a memory. Every phrase was a ghost. He played and saw Grace's small hands stretched across the keys, heard her counting out the rhythm under her breath, felt the warmth of her presence beside him on the piano bench. The pain was excruciating, and yet threaded through it was something else, something that felt almost like healing. How long had he run from this? 8 years of refusing to let himself feel the connection to music because it was too tied up with his daughter. 8 years of denying himself the one thing that had brought him joy, because that joy was now inseparable from loss. But sitting here now, playing for the first time in so long, he realized something that felt like truth. Grace wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted him to abandon music because of her. She had loved the piano, not because it connected her to him, but because it connected her to something larger, something beautiful and true. If she were here now, she would be angry with him for giving it up. She would tell him that music wasn't about grief or loss. It was about life, about expressing what words couldn't capture. A tear slid down Elijah's weathered cheek as he transitioned into a new piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. His fingers found the notes with an authority that surprised him, the years of training and practice rising up from wherever they had been hiding. This was who he was. Not just a homeless man seeking shelter, not just a broken father mourning his child, but a musician. Someone who could take silence and transform it into meaning. The realization was both painful and liberating. Jonathan appeared at his side during a break between pieces. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "The guests are really enjoying the music." "Thank you for this," Elijah said. And Jonathan understood he wasn't just talking about the job or the money. He was thanking him for the gift of remembering who he used to be. "You're welcome. Listen, the cocktail hour is wrapping up. They're about to serve dinner, and then there will be speeches and the auction. You can take a break during dinner if you want, and then maybe play for another hour during the mingling afterward." Elijah nodded. "That sounds fine." As Jonathan walked away, Cassandra Whitmore materialized at the piano, her face set in an expression of cold determination. She had been watching, had seen the way guests responded to the music, and it galled her. This man, this homeless person she had ordered removed from her event, was becoming a talking point. People were asking about him, complimenting the music. She needed to reassert control. "I want you gone after dinner," she said, her voice low so nearby guests wouldn't hear. "You've served your purpose. Jonathan will pay you and then you need to leave." "I agreed to play for a few hours," Elijah said calmly. "I'll stay until then. I'm not asking. This is my event and I decide who stays and who goes." She leaned closer, her perfume cloying and expensive. "You think because you can play a few pretty songs that you belong here? You don't. Look at you. Look at where you are. You're nothing. You're nobody. And after tonight, everyone here will forget you even existed." Her words were meant to wound, to put him back in what she considered his place. And they did wound, cutting deep into the places where Elijah was already vulnerable. But they also did something else. They sparked something that had been dormant for 8 years. Not anger exactly, but a kind of defiance, a refusal to be erased. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am nobody, but music isn't about who you are, it's about what you can create. And tonight, just for a few hours, I'm creating something beautiful. That's more than most people ever do." Cassandra's eyes flashed with fury. "We'll see about that. After dinner, I'm having you removed. And if you try to make a scene, I'll make sure you're banned from every shelter in the city. Do you understand me?" She swept away before he could respond, leaving Elijah alone at the piano. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them back on the keys. Cassandra's threat was real. She had the connections, the influence to make his already difficult life nearly impossible. But as he began to play again, something shifted inside him. For 8 years he had been running from memories, from pain, from himself. He had made himself small, invisible, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, accepting whatever scraps the world offered. He had let grief diminish him until there was almost nothing left. But Grace hadn't been small. She had been full of life, full of joy, full of fearless enthusiasm for the world. Even at 8 years old, she had known who she was and what she loved. She had never apologized for her passion, never dimmed her light to make others comfortable. If he walked away now, if he let Cassandra silence him, he would be betraying everything his daughter had taught him. He would be choosing safety over truth, invisibility over authenticity. And suddenly, after 8 years of just trying to survive, Elijah found that he wanted something more. He wanted to truly live, even if just for one more evening. The dinner service began, and Elijah took his break. Jonathan brought him a plate of the same food the guests were eating, a kindness that didn't go unnoticed. As he ate in a quiet corner backstage, he could hear the speeches beginning in the ballroom. Cassandra thanking everyone for their generosity. Various board members talking about the foundation's work. The usual rhetoric of charity events. But Elijah's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the Rachmaninoff he had performed that night with Grace in the audience. The way she had looked at him afterward, her eyes shining with pride and love. The promise he had made to her that they would always play together. He couldn't keep that promise. Grace was gone, and nothing would bring her back. But he could honor her memory. He could play the way she would have wanted him to play, with his whole heart, holding nothing back. When the dinner concluded and guests began to mingle again, Jonathan came to fetch him. "Ready for the final set?" "Yes," Elijah said. "But I'd like to make a small change to the plan, if that's all right." "What kind of change?" "Instead of just background music, I'd like to play a proper piece, a real performance. Just one piece and then I'll leave." Elijah met Jonathan's eyes. "I know it's not what we agreed to, but I need to do this, for reasons I can't quite explain." Jonathan hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan, and he knew Cassandra would be furious. But something in Elijah's face, a determination mixed with vulnerability, made him nod. "All right, one piece. Make it count." As they walked back into the ballroom, Cassandra intercepted them, her face already set in anger. "I told you to have him leave after dinner, Jonathan." "One more piece," Jonathan said firmly. "Then he'll go. You have my word. This is unacceptable." "I will not." But before she could finish, Elijah walked past her to the piano. The ballroom was full again. Guests refreshed from dinner, champagne flowing freely. Most weren't paying attention to the piano or the man approaching it. But that was about to change. Elijah sat down at the bench and adjusted his position. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. He knew what he needed to play. The piece he had been practicing when Grace died. The piece he had never been able to finish. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Third movement, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, a whirlwind of notes that required absolute precision and complete emotional commitment. He looked out at the crowd of elegantly dressed strangers at Cassandra, standing near the stage with her arms crossed and her expression hostile at Jonathan, watching with concern and hope. And then he looked down at the keys. "This is for you, Grace," he whispered. "This is for you." And he began to play. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata third movement cut through the ambient conversation like a lightning bolt. The piece begins with rapid, insistent arpeggios, a restless energy that demands immediate attention. Elijah's fingers flew across the keys, 8 years of silence, exploding into a cascade of notes that filled the ballroom with their urgency and power. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Heads turned toward the piano, drawn by the sheer force of what they were hearing. This wasn't background music. This wasn't pleasant ambiance. This was a performance raw and uncompromising, and it commanded attention. Cassandra's eyes widened with shock and then narrowed with fury. This wasn't what she had agreed to. This homeless man was turning her carefully orchestrated event into his personal concert hall. She took a step toward the piano, ready to intervene, but Jonathan caught her arm. "Let him finish," Jonathan said quietly but firmly. "This is outrageous. He's ruining everything," Cassandra hissed. "Listen," Jonathan said simply. "Just listen." And Cassandra, despite her anger, found herself unable to do anything but listen. Because what Elijah was playing was extraordinary. The piece is a technical monster, requiring fingers to move with machine-like precision at breakneck speed while maintaining musicality and expression. Even professional pianists approach it with trepidation. But Elijah's hands moved across the keyboard as if they had been waiting 8 years for exactly this moment. Every note was clear, every phrase shaped with intentionality. The rapid passages sparkled like light on water. The brief moments of melodic respite sang with a beauty that made hearts ache. But it wasn't just the technical brilliance that held the room captive. It was the emotion pouring from the instrument. Elijah wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story. Every phrase carried weight, meaning, feeling. The piece is meant to evoke a storm, and that's exactly what Elijah created. But it wasn't a storm of rain and wind. It was a storm of human emotion. Grief and rage and longing and love, all woven together into a tapestry of sound that was almost unbearable in its intensity. In the front row of onlookers, a woman began to cry, moved by something she couldn't quite name. Near the bar, a man who had been laughing moments before now stood perfectly still, his face reflecting the journey Elijah was taking them on. All around the ballroom, people found themselves transported, caught up in the spell of the music. Elijah himself was no longer in the Grandview Hotel. He was in the conservatory concert hall, hearing Grace applaud in the audience. He was in his living room, teaching his daughter the opening bars of this very piece, her small hands trying to reach the intervals. He was at her funeral, numb and broken. He was in the years that followed, lost and adrift. Every moment of joy, every instant of pain, every second of the long journey from professor to homeless man, it was all in the music. His fingers raced through the middle section, the relentless 16th notes building tension with each measure. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. His weathered coat seemed incongruous against the elegance of the instrument, but no one noticed or cared. In this moment, Elijah Washington was exactly where he belonged. The piece builds to a series of dramatic climaxes, each one seeming like it might be the conclusion, only to surge forward with renewed energy. Elijah navigated them all with a mix of power and control that left the audience breathless. His hands moved with such speed they seemed to blur, yet every note remained distinct, crystalline. And then came the final push to the conclusion. The tempo increased. The dynamic swelled. The left hand thundered up and down the lower register, while the right hand wove intricate patterns in the treble. It was like watching a man pour out everything inside him, holding nothing back, gambling everything on this single moment. In that moment, Elijah wasn't playing for the audience. He was playing for Grace. He was playing the piece he should have played the day she died, the practice they should have had that afternoon, but never did because fate had other plans. He was saying goodbye. He was saying, "I'm sorry." He was saying, "I love you." He was saying, "I remember." He was saying, "I'll never forget." The final chords came like hammer blows, definitive and final. Elijah struck them with a force that seemed impossible from his worn frame, the sound resonating through the ballroom and into the silence that followed. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The spell of the music held them all suspended, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slowly at first, tentative, as if unsure whether applause was appropriate. But it was quickly joined by another pair of hands, and another, until suddenly the entire ballroom erupted in applause. Not polite charity applause, not obligatory acknowledgement, but thunderous, genuine appreciation for something remarkable they had just experienced. People stood. They cheered. They wiped tears from their faces and applauded harder. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" near the stage. An elderly gentleman, who had been a classical music critic for the city's newspaper for 30 years, turned to his wife with wonder in his eyes. "That was masterful," he said. "Truly masterful." At the piano, Elijah sat motionless, his hands still resting on the keys, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no move to wipe them away. For the first time in 8 years, he had allowed himself to fully feel everything. The pain, yes, but also the beauty. The loss, yes, but also the love that had created that loss. And in releasing it all through the music, he had found something he thought was gone forever. He had found himself. Jonathan was applauding too, his face lit with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had known the man could play, but he had never imagined this. This was artistry of the highest order. This was the kind of performance that people would talk about for years. And Cassandra stood frozen, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She couldn't deny what she had just heard, couldn't dismiss or diminish it. Whatever else this man was, whatever his current circumstances, he was undeniably incredibly talented. More than talented. Gifted. As the applause continued, someone in the crowd called out, "Who is he? Who is the pianist?" Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Elijah Washington." He paused, then added, "Former professor of music at the Berkshire Conservatory, award-winning concert pianist, and one of the most remarkable musicians I've ever had the privilege of hearing." The applause, which had begun to fade, surged again with renewed energy, but now it was mixed with gasps of surprise, whispers of recognition. Several people in the crowd knew the Berkshire Conservatory knew its reputation. Some even remembered hearing of Elijah Washington, the brilliant young professor who had disappeared from the music world years ago under tragic circumstances. "My God," someone whispered. "Elijah Washington. I thought he was dead." "What happened to him?" another voice asked. "Why is he—" The question trailed off, the answer obvious and heartbreaking. As the applause finally began to subside, an older woman made her way through the crowd toward the piano. She was in her 70s, elegantly dressed with white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her name was Dorothy Chen, and she had been the dean of the Berkshire Conservatory when Elijah had taught there before her retirement 5 years ago. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Elijah Washington. Is it really you?" Elijah looked up at her, and recognition flooded his face. "Dean Chen. Oh, my dear boy." She reached out and took his hands in hers, not caring about his worn appearance, seeing only the person she had known and respected. We didn't know what happened to you. You just disappeared. We tried to find you to help, but you were gone." "I'm sorry," Elijah said, his voice rough with emotion. I wasn't able to. I know. I heard about Grace, about your wife. I'm so sorry." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "But Elijah, that performance just now, that was incredible. You haven't lost it. If anything, you've deepened. There was such emotion, such truth in every note." By now, a crowd had gathered around the piano. People wanted to meet him, to talk to him, to understand how someone with such extraordinary talent had ended up on the streets. Jonathan stood protectively near Elijah, making sure he wasn't overwhelmed, but the attention was genuine and kind. These weren't people gawking at a spectacle. These were people who had been moved by what they heard and wanted to express their appreciation. A man in his 50s stepped forward, introducing himself as Marcus Brennan, a music teacher at the city's Performing Arts High School. "Mr. Washington, that was one of the most powerful performances I've ever witnessed. The way you interpreted that piece. I've heard it performed hundreds of times, but never like that. Never with such raw honesty." Others echoed similar sentiments. Compliments poured in from every direction. Someone offered him their coat, noticing how worn his was. Another pressed money into his hand, insisting he take it. A woman who owned a restaurant offered him meals anytime he needed them. But through it all, Cassandra Whitmore stood apart. Her face pale and drawn. She watched the scene unfolding with growing horror, not at Elijah's circumstances, but at her own behavior. She had publicly humiliated him, had threatened him, had treated him with contempt and cruelty, all because of his appearance, his circumstances. And now, in front of all these people, her prejudice was being exposed for what it was. Dorothy Chen noticed Cassandra standing there, and with the directness of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority, addressed her. "Ms. Whitmore, I understand you tried to have Elijah removed from your event tonight." Cassandra's face flushed. I didn't know who he was. Does that matter?" Dorothy's voice was gentle but firm. Should it matter who someone was in order to treat them with basic human dignity? The question hung in the air, and Cassandra had no answer. Around her, guests who had witnessed her treatment of Elijah earlier in the evening were looking at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. Her carefully cultivated image, her reputation for grace and philanthropy, was crumbling in front of everyone who mattered in her social circle. "I think," Dorothy continued, "that we've all learned something important tonight. About assumptions, about how we judge people based on appearances, about remembering that everyone has a story, a history, a worth that goes far deeper than what we can see on the surface." She turned back to Elijah. "Where have you been staying? Shelters mostly. Sometimes the street when there's no room. Dorothy's expression hardened with determination. Not anymore. As of tonight, we're going to make sure you have what you need. A place to live. Proper meals. And if you're willing, if you're ready, I know several music schools that would be honored to have you on their faculty. Part-time on your terms. No pressure. I'm not sure I can, Elijah started to say. You just played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata third movement with a mastery that would put most concert pianists to shame, Dorothy said. After 8 years away from the piano. If that doesn't prove you're capable, I don't know what does. Marcus, the high school music teacher, spoke up. I meant what I said, Mr. Washington. That performance was extraordinary. If you ever wanted to give a masterclass for my students, or even just talk to them about music, about perseverance, about finding your way back to the things you love, it would be invaluable. Other offers followed. A retired conductor offered to introduce him to people in the city's music scene. Someone who ran a small concert series offered him a performing opportunity paid whenever he felt ready. A lawyer offered pro bono help with getting him back on his feet legally and financially. The outpouring was overwhelming. Elijah, who had spent 8 years being invisible, ignored or scorned, suddenly found himself surrounded by people who saw him, truly saw him, and wanted to help. His walls built so carefully over the years to protect himself from feeling too much began to crumble. Why, he asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do all this for me? Dorothy smiled, squeezing his hand. Because you're one of us, Elijah. You're a musician, an artist, a teacher. That doesn't change because of circumstance. And besides, she gestured around the room, you gave all of us something precious tonight. You reminded us what music can do, how it can transform a moment, open hearts, speak truths that words can't express. That's a gift beyond measure. Jonathan, who had been watching from the side with tears streaming down his face, approached and put a hand on Elijah's shoulder. I'm glad I trusted my instincts, he said. When I saw the way you looked at that piano earlier, I knew there was something special there. Thank you for proving me right. Elijah looked around at all these faces, these strangers who had become, in the span of a single evening, benefactors, supporters, even friends. For the first time in 8 years, he felt something besides grief and exhaustion. He felt hope. The charity gala continued for another hour, but the energy had shifted. What had begun as another typical high society fundraiser had become something more meaningful. People talked not just about the usual gossip and networking, but about Elijah's performance, about his story, about what they had witnessed. Several guests, moved by the evening's events, made additional donations to the Whitmore Foundation, though they specified that a portion should go toward helping homeless individuals in the city. Cassandra herself had retreated to a corner of the ballroom, nursing a drink and trying to process what had happened. Her event had been successful. The foundation would raise significant funds, but her personal reputation had taken a serious hit. She had been exposed as someone who valued appearances over substance, who was willing to be cruel to those she deemed beneath her. The irony wasn't lost on her that this was supposed to be a charity event, a demonstration of her compassion and generosity, and instead it had revealed the limits of her empathy. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, many stopped by to shake Elijah's hand one more time, to offer final words of encouragement, to slip him business cards with phone numbers and email addresses. Call me, they said. Seriously, call me. We'll figure out how to help. Dorothy had already arranged for Elijah to stay at a small hotel for the next week, expenses paid, while more permanent arrangements could be made. She had his old personnel file from the conservatory and had already started making calls to colleagues and friends in the music world, letting them know that Elijah Washington had resurfaced and needed support. As the ballroom emptied, Elijah found himself alone at the piano once more. The instrument that had been both his salvation and his torment. The thing that connected him to his greatest joy and his deepest pain. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not playing, just feeling the familiar, smooth surface beneath his worn fingertips. "I did it, Grace," he whispered. "I played again. For you. For me. For everyone who needed to hear it." He could almost feel her presence beside him, could almost hear her excited voice. "I knew you could do it, Daddy. I knew you'd play again." The grief was still there. It would always be there, a part of him as permanent as his own heartbeat. But it had changed somehow. It was no longer a crushing weight that made each day a struggle to survive. It had become something else. A reminder, a connection, a tribute to a life that had been short, but had mattered, had meant something had changed him in ways that even tragedy couldn't erase. Jonathan approached one final time, carrying an envelope. "This is from me personally. Not what we agreed on for playing tonight, but what I think your performance was actually worth." He handed the envelope to Elijah. "And this," he produced a business card, "is my personal number. I meant what I said before. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." Elijah opened the envelope to find not the $100 they had agreed upon, but 1,000. "Jonathan, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not nearly enough. But it's a start." Jonathan smiled. "You gave something to everyone here tonight that money can't buy. You reminded us all why art matters, why music matters, why we should never judge a book by its cover, no matter how worn that cover might be." After Jonathan left, Elijah sat alone in the now empty ballroom. The chandeliers were being dimmed. The catering staff was cleaning up. The night was ending, but something new was beginning. He thought about the path that had led him here, the tragedy that had broken him, the years of wandering, of barely surviving, of believing that the best parts of himself were gone forever. And then, tonight. The music flowing from his fingers after 8 years of silence, the standing ovation, the recognition, the kindness of strangers who had become allies in the span of a few hours. Life hadn't given him back what he had lost. Grace was still gone. Those years on the streets had still happened. The pain was still real. But what he had found tonight was equally real. The music wasn't gone. The part of himself that could create beauty, that could communicate through sound, what words could never express it, had survived. It had been buried, but not destroyed. As he stood to leave, he placed his hand one more time on the piano. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the instrument, to Jonathan, to Dorothy, and all the others who had shown him kindness, or to Grace herself. Maybe he was thanking all of them. He walked out of the Grandview Hotel into the night. It had stopped raining. The air was cool and clean, washed fresh by the storm. He still wore his worn coat, still carried the same bag with his few possessions. In the eyes of anyone passing by, he was still just another homeless man on the city streets. But Elijah knew different now. He knew that circumstances didn't define worth, that tragedy didn't have to be the end of the story, that gifts, even when buried under years of pain and loss, could resurface when the time was right. That music, real music, came not from technique or perfection, but from the willingness to open your heart and pour out whatever was inside, beautiful or broken or both. He had a hotel room waiting for him, warm and safe. He had money in his pocket, more than he had held in years. He had job prospects, support people who believed in him. But more than any of that, he had something he thought was lost forever. He had himself back As he walked through the city streets toward his temporary lodging, Elijah found himself humming. It was a simple melody, something Grace used to sing around the house. He hadn't been able to bear hearing it for 8 years, but now it felt like a greeting from an old friend. The pain of her absence was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined everything. Because Grace hadn't been about pain. She had been about joy, about music, about love and light, and the pure pleasure of being alive. And by reclaiming his music tonight, Elijah had reclaimed that part of her too. She lived in every note he played, in every piece he would perform in the future, in the students he might teach, in the beauty he could create with 88 keys and 2 hands. The homeless man who had walked into the Grandview Hotel just hours earlier, seeking only shelter from the rain, was gone. In his place was a musician who had remembered his purpose, an artist who had found his voice again, a father who had discovered that the best way to honor his daughter's memory wasn't to run from what they had shared, but to embrace it, to let it transform his pain into something that could move and inspire others. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding a life, healing from trauma, learning to trust again, finding his place in a world that had moved on without him. These things would take time and effort. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Elijah Washington felt equal to those challenges. Tonight, he had proved something to himself that he needed to know, that he wasn't broken beyond repair, that his gifts were still there waiting to be used. That one moment of courage, one decision to stop running and start playing could change everything. As he reached the hotel and checked in with the information Dorothy had arranged, as he entered the small but clean room with its real bed and its shower and its safety, Elijah made himself a promise. The same promise he had made to Grace all those years ago. The one he thought he had broken. He would play again. Not just once, not just tonight, but every chance he got. He would teach again, sharing what he knew with students who needed guidance. He would perform again, giving audiences what they had given him tonight. That moment of transcendence when music speaks to the soul. He would live again. Truly live. Not just survive, not just get through each day, but engage with life in all its complexity and challenge and beauty. Because that's what Grace would have wanted. That's what she had always embodied. And that's what the music demanded of him. As he lay down on the hotel bed, exhausted, but more at peace than he had been in years, Elijah closed his eyes and saw his daughter's face one more time. Not frozen in the moment of the accident, not from the funeral, but as she had been in life. Smiling, laughing, full of energy and joy and love. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." And for the first time in 8 years, Elijah Washington slept without nightmares, his dreams filled not with loss, but with music.